flatness of someone repeating a script. They reviewed a number of folios. They asked about sources. Matthias felt his mouth fill with a static. He remembered the ledger under his mattress at night, the ledger that smelled faintly of smoke, its edges scabbed with the memory of a fire that had not wanted to die. He had hidden it because it was inconvenient. He had hidden it because the thing it contained was sharp as a bone. Each time he had put it away, he had hoarded a small, shameful hope that the ledger might not be discovered. Did they mention anything specific? Thomas asked, appearing at the outer sill as if he had been listening through mortar. He wore dust on his boots, and had the look of someone who had been sent to the doors of houses and asked to remember which faces were there. Galen clasped his hands and looked at each table as if they were congregants. They named certain sections. They spoke of errors in redaction. They expressed concern very perfunctory about seditious inserts. His fingers twisted the hem of his robe. He did not say more. There was an economy in his silence that spoke in the same currency as the men who had taken him. Matthias felt the air change in the room, as if someone had closed a door he had not known was open. The men's faces, which had been polite before, now hummed with the low competence of those who have placed a piece on a board and are watching the effect of their move. One of them stepped toward Thomas and asked him in even, clinical tones about his rotes. "We are reviewing delivery protocols," he said. "Routine security." It was no longer a simple occupation. It was an assessment. When Thomas left, he went pale and fast. He came back and slid into his stool like a bird into a thicket. "They shadowed 2 roads," he said briefly, "blocked a lane outside the south gate for an hour. My pack was inspected twice. They asked to see ledgers in my satchel." His hand made a small, insider's sign for the packages he carried. In the marketplace, people pay attention to hands. Later, when Matthias went to Mira's stall for the bread he always bought to cut corners, the market smelled of heat and citrus peel and spilled oil. Mira's voice was louder than it used to be, an instrument pitched to gather gossip and sell it as commodity. That afternoon a hush settled on her face. Her cheek held the blue bloom of a bruise that a winter's sky would have envied for its color. Her shawl had been tugged, her apron searched. Men with neat cuffs and paler sigils had forced her to open the boxes where she kept account of small debts, arrears, and household names. They left her with a caution as clear as a coin: keep quiet and the pain goes away. Ask, and we will teach you its forms. Matthias listened and tasted the same acid he had felt when he watched Galen's shoulders go under. The scriptorium was not a private library. It was a limb of the state, skin-thin and liable to fracture. The ledger that he held under his bed sat like a scar under clean cloth. He knew, in the way one knows the pressure of a stone underfoot, that the ledger would be of interest to men who measured the city in casualties and in bargains kept for a price. In the afternoon, while the light went molten and the lamps were set to the first of their duties, an official notice arrived. A formal memorandum requesting the scriptorium's cooperation in a review of certain documents deemed to contain anomalous entries. The memorandum was bare of warmth. It invoked the security of the sanctuary and the preservation of public order. It contained the Chancellor's emblem in an authoritative ink that did not blot. To read the memorandum was to feel the shape of an ordered world closing in. It was not until after the notice was pinned to the board that Thomas ventured an addition in a voice lowered like a petitioner. "They took a man from the watches today," he said. "Old Bird was summoned and did not return. They asked him about gatherings near the docks." He spat the word docks as if it were an accusation. "They want to know who remembers." Matthias sat with the ledger in the privacy of the curtained stall that Galen kept for his private codices. His hands trembled not yet from fear of being caught, but from the sharp arithmetic that presented itself, one man extracted for questioning. Courier routes watched. Informants bruised in the market. An explicit demand for records. The architecture of suppression is not all bared walls and burning. Sometimes it is quiet notices pinned to walls, a faculty of legal phrasing used like a scalpel. He thought of the ledger's names and the dates that matched the rebellion's collapse. He thought of his mother's quiet smile when she told the tale of the family's prudence. He thought of the price that had been paid in named coin and in blood that could not be turned back now, even if the names were put to paper. There were things a person learned in a place that keeps books. One is that people leave traces, a hand smear, a margin note, an errant docket. Another is that institutions kept their own habits, and that those habits could become instruments of violence. Matthias understood, as the sun drew back and a thin cough of wind sidled through the scriptorium windows, that the instrument had been trained on them. Galen did not speak of what they had required of him beyond what he had told. But there are manners by which a man yields a small, habitual stiffening of the throat, a new shyness in asking for ink. When Galen paused a moment with his hand on a folio, as if seeking the courage to open it, Matthias watched his fingers. They had always been the hands of an actor who had learned to make the state's story cohere. Now they looked like the hands of someone who knew he might soon be reprieved of their ability to accord comfort. That evening the notice at the foot of the door included a thin, opaque edition. The Chancellor had authorized a review across several archives, beginning with the scriptorium, and instructed that couriers and vendors be subject to inspections. The language was the language of safety and health. The meaning was the language of coercion. Matthias could think in lists, who had access to his ledger. Edda trusted but careful, Sister Unwin safe but slow, Jasper dangerous but cunning, Ryan an uncertain ally in uniform, Thomas now watched, Mera now marked. Each name, when moved into the circle of suspicion, changed the problem from what it had been into something like a question with no known solution. The ledger, once a secret in the quiet of a night, had become a hot coal under their shoes. When he finally took out the ledger that night, his hands moved as if on someone else's cue. The binding creaked a little and seemed to sound like a syllable of complaint. The pages had a smell he had come to know and hate, smoke, old oil, and the faint, coppery tang of memory. He passed his finger along an index entry and felt again the edge of what had happened years ago. Names, payments, dates. The penmanship was businesslike. The tone, bureaucratic. It read like a ledger and not like a lament, which made it more terrible. It had been collated as business, as calculation, as the arithmetic of living. It was all the more damning for its lack of flourish. He thought of Galen's brought-back hush and the men's polite eyes. The Chancellor's purview was a machine that preferred clean surfaces to messy truths. It had the patience of long craft and the appetite of an animal quietly gnawing at bone. If the ledger were discovered, it would be contested as a possible forgery. It would be called a fabrication. They would place doubt like a die in the well and watch memory curl with it. Or they would seize the scriptorium and burn the pages and call the act preservation. Or they would take the ledger and alter it, whitewashing names by addition rather than subtraction. The ledger would not be safe. Nothing would be safe. He thought of his family. The ledger's secret had kept them alive, or at least had been an explanation for their taste of safety. His mother tended her kitchen with a small, measured contentment. His cousin had a small clerkship and a cautious manner. To expose the ledger would be to risk them all. To conceal it would be to bear a compounding guilt. Matthias sat there, feeling the narrowness of the future as if it were a hallway that had been walled at both ends and where the interior lights were beginning to wink out. The scriptorium's doors were not only wooden panels, they were thresholds of history. If they were closed now, they would close on his chance to move the ledger into wider light. He realized, with a coldness as precise as a ruler's edge, that the place that had been his shelter could at any moment become a prison. He put the ledger back under the mattress of his bedroll in the curtained cubicle and smoothed the sheets to cover it. The motions were habitual, but the feeling behind them had changed. There was now an urgency that had for months been tickling at the edges of his work, a sense that motions, once safe, were no longer so. He could not yet see the solution. He could only see the door being closed. A distant bell tolled in the city, twice, once, twice again, an official measure of hours and not of time. Galen, now quieter and more brittle, set his stool against the table and whispered a curt instruction that was more plea than command: be cautious. Watch the couriers. Do not stand out. Matthias heard the words and imbibed their literal limitation like an order to breathe less deeply. He had, in the last days, been willing to risk much for the ledger's truth. In that moment he felt the pressure of the closed world on his chest, and understood that the ledger's truth might require a new courage, to move despite a city that labored to keep its bones in place. The noose was tightening. The question pressed into him like a made thing: how long before there would be no room left to act? He would learn, as the night grew dense and the lamps burned thin, that the answer was not long. The Chancellor did not work in haste, but he did not require haste. He cultivated inevitability. The men who had come with polite questions had left behind a silence that was not natural to the stacks. The pages seemed to lean closer to listen. Matthias went to bed with the ledger under his pillow, and the sense of a door closing echoing in his head. In the dark, the city's noises seemed reduced to a chattering at the edges of a war no one wanted to remember. He counted the hours like a man counting debts. 1, 2, 3, not enough. When sleep came, it was thin and populated by the soft shapes of names, each one a small lantern he feared would be extinguished. He dreamed of Galen's hands folding like old maps, and of men in neat coats cataloguing not books but people. He woke before dawn with the taste of iron in his mouth and the ledger's hum against his ribs. Outside, the city arranged itself as it always arranged itself in the hour before the market. Men yawned and the bellows of a baker sounded like a distant sigh. But inside the room the hour counted differently. It was the hour of decisions that such rooms make with reticence. Matthias rose and smoothed his clothes with trembling care. He drew the curtain back an inch and watched the scriptorium's windows catch the first hospital light. He thought of the ledger and the names it held, and of the men who had already made their move. There was a knock at the scriptorium door that had no ordinary meaning, a formal rap, 3 measured strokes. And then a pause, as though the knocker were listening to the cadence of his own heart. He felt the same curious arithmetic he had when he used his ruler, a space, a measure, a set of margins. He stood buttoning his coat with fingers that were not as steady as he would have liked. The door opened and an aide from the Chancellor's office stood on the threshold with a folded memorandum and the same calm, absolute eyes. He inclined his head with the inflexible courtesy of those who do not expect a refusal. "We require a review of the scriptorium's holdings," the aide said. "We will be thorough." Matthias's throat closed, and the ledger beneath his pillow seemed to pulse like a trapped heartbeat. The door to the room had been offered and then, with the aide's arrival, closed. The Chancellor's reaches had become corporeal. The scriptorium's shelter had become the first room of the siege. He thought of the ledger, of Galen, of Mira's bruise and Thomas's pale look, and felt, suddenly and precisely, the moral ledger of his own life tipped toward a balance he had not yet consented to. Outside, somewhere in the city, the news would be translated into talk and then into fear. Inside, the archives would be pried open. Matthias did not know how to fight an office. He only knew how to keep things in order until the order changed. He gathered his instruments and set them inside their case. He packed the ledger, tight and secret, and put the case where his hand would reach, but without thought. He did not yet know whether he would move the ledger into the light or sink it forever beneath fresh redactions. He only knew that the door had been closed and that every act henceforward would be measured against the sound of its latch. He walked to the door and opened it. Beyond stood the aide and his neat men, and for a moment there was nothing but the small, precise geometry of their arrangement. Matthias, in that small, exacting instant, felt how fragile a life had become when set inside the great hand of a state that had learned the usefulness of forgetting. He invited them in. The city had learned to read its own wounds. Scarred facades bore the latticed marks of old fires like a hand that would not stop trembling. Doorways still held the smell of sodden ash beneath the usual stew and smoke. On mornings when the sky was pale and uncommitted, the streets produced a thin, persistent murmur of cart wheels, of distant hammers, of people rehearsing the identity the capital demanded. Told often enough that identity stiffened and became doctrine. The Chronicle was the spine of that story. Matthias Corvin had spent so many hours learning the Chronicle's cadence that he could feel its rhythms in his pulse, the flat, inevitable syntax of sanctioned omission, the little verbs that excised guilt and placed duty as an axiom. Yet all such controlled language depended upon a faith of material things inked that could be trusted, hands that did not deliberately lie, seals that meant what they said. He became aware of the aversion first as a change inside his mouth. He had been at the market to move a small errand, a purchase of good writing quills for Galen that he could not risk buying in the scriptorium's official ledger, and the light slid across Mira's stall. Catching the thin paper of a folded pamphlet, she pushed toward him as if they'd always been conspirators in the commerce of rumor. "It's a copy," she said, in the low voice that matched her trade business disguised as gossip, "or a copy of a copy. They're resaying its proof. Folks are reading Making Families Red, and then calling Mara a liar." The way she said Mara's name had the mixture of scorn and fear that made Matthias start to understand the scale of what had begun. He took the fold of paper with gloves of restraint he tried to wear even on idle errands and unfurled it. The ink seemed to sit on the page with a confidence that made his training ache. Not the quick, nervous scrawl of an anxious hand, nor the smudgy print of a market pamphleteer trying to keep pace with a thought. This was practiced. The letters were spaced in the patient meter of the scriptorium, an imitation of the Chronicle's formal script, and at the top, a seal impression had been shaded in such a way that the shading created the illusion of stamped depth. The name listed matched a small cluster of names the ledger had contained only the dates, and the phrasing was shifted so that the ledger appeared to indicate a different arrangement. Instead of betrayers receiving money, this copy insisted payments were imposed upon those who later claimed to be betrayed, a fine levied for sedition. Matthias felt the page tilt in his hands as if it were a small door, and inside that door was another city, with its own laws. He read the words twice, then a third time to reassure himself that he had not misread. Someone had learned how to make a lie that looked like the Chronicle. He folded the pamphlet away and handed it back to Mira, because he could not bear to keep that shape in his satchel. "Who sells this?" he asked without daring to show any authority. She shrugged. "Somebody with a hand in the alleys, a man with a pack. I saw him, Jasper, they call him. He'll trade a new truth for old coin." The name landed like a cold stone. Jasper Mahler had been in the margins of Matthias's investigations before. A man remembered for the low cunning of a hands-on trade, an apprentice turned mercenary with ink and gullibility. In the scriptorium he had once been a cautionary tale, a good eye corrupted by impatience. Now, out in the market with a pack of pamphlets that promised to exonerate the powerful by blaming the grieving, he had become weapon. "If people read this and believe it," Matthias said, "the ledger we found won't stand a day. Men will laugh at any copy that cannot be proved. They'll say it's one of Jasper's, and thus implausible, and therefore every ledger may be Jasper's." Myra's hand shrank still as they balanced a saucer of coins for a buyer. "They'll say that, and the Chancellor will use them for a pretext." His first instinct was to tell Galen and have them burn the copy, to file it away like a tooth and pretend it had never existed. The scriptorium taught erasure for the sake of order, but the lesson that had brought Matthias to the ledger forbade him that neatness. If a falsehood as good as this could be crafted with the right labor, then proof alone, he realized with a cold certainty, could be a poor defender of truth. Material authenticity, the weight of paper, the age of ink, the shape of a seal could be imitated. What remained then was no longer merely evidence, but the story of how that evidence had been kept and transmitted. He could feel the ledger's fate slipping into a contest over provenance, not truth. He went that afternoon to the tavern at the corner of Lister's Row, because taverns had ears and because rumors needed a place to lose their awkward shells. The room was a low, breathing belly of wood and torch smoke where people said things in chunks and left out the clauses that might incriminate them. Edda met him inside, slipping from shadow to shadow like she had worn the darkness as armor. Her eyes, always quick to analyze, were molten with vexation. "They've been handed to every stall," she said, tilting her chin toward the serving hatch. "2 copies at the scribe's market, 1 by the fishmonger's stall. Jasper's hand, they say. Heavens, do you believe they will hold?" Matthias asked. "That people will accept these as counterproof?" Edda breathed out like someone blowing away the small flames of reason. "They will hold if it's enough to seed doubt. Once a fact is uncertain, all facts become suspect. Our ledger does not stand on a mountain of witnesses. It stands on a handful of corroborations and a lot of quiet truth. Jasper's work makes the public jury incompetent." Inside the tavern, a scrap of shouting dragged their attention. A man was pounding a pamphlet on a table as if the paper itself had betrayed him. "There it is!" he cried. "See. Proof. These names were paid fines. They were punished. Why bring up old debts, woman?" The woman clutched a second pamphlet, and her hands were shaking enough to make the letters quiver. A child by her feet stared at the pages like a map to nowhere. Matthias felt the axis of the room tilt. He moved closer, Edda shadowing him, and the smell of stew and spilled ale made him think of the scriptorium's inks, the same metallic tang, as if the city and the hands that recorded it shared a chemical memory. Maravel stood at the far end of the room, her cloak a wind breath of motion. She had a printed list in her hand that named the missing. Her voice, when she spoke, was the kind that filled a room without commanding. "These are the names of the disappeared," she said, and the syllables were a humble litany. "We cannot let them be turned to accusation by those who profit." An angry voice cut across her. "Who printed these?" A man demanded. "Look, here are names, yes. But here's another by the baker that says the opposite. Which of you lies? Which of you has the coin to buy a printer?" The tavern became a theater in miniature for the city's sudden malaise. Jostlings, a tankard thrown, benches scratched. A woman sobbed and read aloud a name she recognized. "My brother Carrot Halve, he is here. He died. He did not take coins." A young man pulled from his pocket a different pamphlet and planted it where the woman's face could see it. "This says he was fined for sedition. He sold the movement out. It says the names were traitors." Matthias had come to understand on a quiet level what public trust felt like in the body. It was a skin you could bruise, an artery that when inflamed changed the whole prospective flow of life. Here that trust had been bruised into suspicion. Men and women shifted their fears from the powerful to one another, and in that shifting the Chancellor's work would be done for him, divide and delegitimize. Mara's face, in profile, was a bright stone of grief. She pushed back with words sudden, slender, and when she did, 2 young men rose to argue with her so loudly that the tavern keeper pushed a tray between them to keep the peace. In other hands the scene could have hardened into a riot. In this room it hardened into 1,000 small verdicts being reached without deliberation, neighbors deciding whose memory to honor, whose to distrust. Matthias watched as folk read the pamphlets like oracles and then folded them away like torn flags. He felt, in the taut wire between his ribs, that his ledger might be smothered under a tide of manufactured ambiguities. The logical clarity of an archival trail could be outflanked by cunning hands that resembled honesty. When the noise thinned, Matthias found himself inside an alleyway smelling of hay and pigeons, standing at a door whose hinges complained at his push. Jasper's workshop had the comfortable ruin of an old house that had become many things. Inside, the light was thin and the scent of oil was a domestic perfume. Jasper smiled as if the city had asked a question and he had supplied an answer. "Ah," he said with a sweep of greeting that was more practiced than affection. "Matthias Corvin, I thought you moved in the corridors of the more solemn institutions." Matthias could have come with rage or with accusations. Instead, he came with a book of questions. "Did you make those copies?" Jasper unhooked a small drawer and lifted a sheet that had been pulled from those very pamphlets. He turned it so that the lamp light licked the ink just like a tide across a pebble. "Yes, I made them because people asked, because people pay for certainty. People want what supports them. Some wanted to palm off a story that exculpated the city officers. Others wanted a story to set the poor folk in their places. I sold what they needed." He explained his craft like a cook explaining spices, the way a dulling agent could make ink look older. The trick of scouring a paper with powdered charcoal to give it musty age. How to press a seal with a metal plate that had been filed and reshaped so it would look like an old stamp, but would not match any current register. "When you do this long enough," he said, loading a spoon with diluted iron gall ink and holding it above a coal's blue, "you learn to make lies that sit right. They add weight. They become convincing, and convincing things alter the shape of belief." Matthias listened as if to a litany for an instrument of evil. But he heard something else beneath the boyish pride, a shudder of unease and a small, private defensiveness. Jasper's hands did not tremble when he worked the tools, but his voice dipped for a heartbeat into confession. "I do not believe always what I make," he said, surprising Matthias with such honesty that it was almost offensive in its normalcy. "Truth and falsehood in paper are business things, Master Corvin. I make coin. You ask for authenticity and buy it. Others ask for contradiction and buy that." Matthias thought of the ledger at his bedside, of the scratch-margin names, of Captain Ryan's face when he read one line aloud, and the way it had rearranged the captain's dated features. "Have you put my ledger into play?" Jasper nodded reluctantly. "Not your ledger. I cannot. Well, I can make copies. But the ledger itself I have not touched. I have a sense of risk. The wrong hand and I have men at my door. But I made documents that would point to different conclusions, because some people like the idea that the rebels were paid and corrupted and not betrayed. That idea benefits people who run the Bureau of Security and men who like a clean ending." Matthias wanted to name Varon then, to say that this was not merely the coin-driven mischief of a man with a pack, but a concerted effort by office and ministry to rewrite the past for power. He could feel the rope of evidence tightening around the Chancellor's neck in his imagination and tried to keep it cautious. "So what do we do?" he asked. Jasper set down his tools and looked at him with an expression that could have been pity or entertainment. "You think there is a single act. There isn't. There is the city. You have to feed the city with truth more often than the liars can sell it. But truth is slow, and people like quick surprise. You cannot outpace a good whisper with a single shout." What Jasper offered sounded like an admission disguised as nihilism, that the market for belief was governed by taste and appetite rather than evidence. Matthias left Jasper's shop with a head that thudded against his collar like a bell. He had expected scandal, he had expected danger, but he had not expected the craft of lying to be so intimate and so industrial. If the production of convincing falsities was now something a public could buy as easily as bread, then the ledger's authority would not be a mere matter of proof, but a matter of culture. At dusk Edda met him by the river. The water held the city's light like a burlap sack, poor and placarded with the colors of lamps. They perched on a low quay where the air smelled of fish and the slow rot of leaves. Jasper will say anything to keep his trade. We cannot trust him to be a moral actor, she said, voice tight. But his skill tells us something useful, that authenticity is now a contested